Right. Right. Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Engels Memorial Lecture. We're just still waiting for some people to join us. Hang on. Yeah, he's in. Okay. My name is Bob Kelly, and I'm trustee of both the Marx Memorial Library and the Working Class Movement Library in Salford, and I'm going to be your chair for tonight. I've been instructed to give you some technical information, and that's what's his name. If people could switch their cameras off, please. I believe this helps with the bandwidth, whatever that is, and also we're hoping to take some questions at the end. If you could pop the questions in the chat facility, which is at the bottom of your screen, then we will endeavour to answer as many questions as we can in the time available to us near the end. Thank you. Okay. So as I just said, this lecture is being co-hosted by the Working Class Movement Library and the Marx Memorial Library, and it's Engels that gives us the link, if you like, to the two places, the two libraries, because of course Engels lived and worked in Salford, and obviously he collaborated with Marx, who was in London, and of course it's especially poignant that we're having this lecture this year because of course it's Engels' 200th birthday, and of course he's often overshadowed by Marx, because Engels was an intellectual giant in his own right, so it's only right that we celebrate two of his seminal works tonight. And I'm delighted that we've got Mary Davis to speak tonight. Not only is she a comrade and the secretary of the Marx Memorial Library, but she's a professor of labour history, and she is widely published on women's history, labour history, imperialism and racism. So the screen is all yours, Mary.
Right. Now, I'm going to apologise in advance for any technological mishaps. I hope there won't be political ones, but there might be technological ones. Right. Okay, so today I want to look, as Bob said, about two of these books: The Condition of the Working Class in England, 1844, and Engels' Origin of Family, Private Property and the State. And also it seems, I'm sure you'll have worked out, this is a rather unlikely relationship. The first book was written by Engels in 1844 when he was only 24 years old. The Origins was published 40 years later, when Engels was, well, quite an old man, after Marx had died anyway. Now, the condition of the English working class is, I think, a masterly exercise in what would be called today by sociologists participant observation. Engels was the participant observer of the beginnings of industrial capitalism, and his book is a social observation of the effects of the devastating impact of the first phase of large-scale industry on workers, on men, on women and children, and their appalling housing conditions. The housing conditions were dreadful, he wrote about this, but Engels, mind you, having said that, these housing conditions of the 1840s bear somewhat of a similarity to living conditions in 2020. I just thought I'd throw that in. But Engels' book is much more than social observation. It is a pre-Marxist analysis of the development of capitalism, providing, as it did actually, primary source material and insights for Volume 1 of Capital, which was published in 1867. Engels discovered the concept and the meaning of exploitation the precise meaning, and he also explained for the first time the general law of capital accumulation. Conditions of the English working class is also an astute contemporary account of the conflict between capital and labour during this a phase of, well, actually with acute economic cyclical crises which characterised Britain's capitalist economy, and certainly until the 1850s and the sort of workshop of the world phase. Engels noted and observed the militancy of the class struggle of those days in the early days of industrialisation, in response to, for example, the campaign against the abolition of the hated Gawler Amendment Act, movement for factory reform, and above all, in the 1842 Chartist General Strike, which I'm very pleased to see that Tameside Metropolitan Borough Council has put a plaque up to it, and does not call it, as was disparagingly called always, the plug riots. This was a general strike over not quite 100 years before the 1926 general strike. I wish I had time to say more about that, but I haven't. So now on to the origins of the family. Well, obviously the subject matter is very different. It's great. The great significance of this book is that it's one of the first Marxist analyses of the development of the family and the origins of women's oppression. It actually wasn't the first. Babel wrote Women and Socialism in 1879, but it's a subject in which most men, including socialist men, were deeply uninterested, and so it's very significant. Thus, the subject matter of Origins is apparently very different to the first book. So you might say, well, why the hell is she trying to look at both books? Isn't it invidious to compare them? There is a link, however, between the two books, and that resides in the analysis or the observation of the working class family in both books. And despite the fact that these books are separated by 40 years, there is a continuum in Engels' analysis of the working class family, and it's an analysis actually which I think is a weakness in both books. Well, I hope to explain that later. That's not to diminish the significance, however, of those books. So in terms of the origins of the family, its long title, Private Property in the State, I'm only going to consider the family in its relation to women's oppression. Now, a lot is made of the empirical shortcomings of the anthropological evidence employed by Engels. I'm not going to enter into this discussion beyond stating that social anthropology has advanced since Morgan wrote his major study of native North Americans, native North Americans, I should say. That is to say, his Ancient Society in 1877. And the Swiss anthropologist Bachhofen, 1861, who wrote on mother right. Engels drew much of his empirical material from these two men. Some of this material may well be flawed, but however much there are anthropological criticisms, I don't, and there might well be, and I'm not an anthropologist, I don't think that those criticisms disprove Engels' underlying thesis, nor do they undermine his historical method. So his schema, as I say, was based very much on Morgan and on Bachhofen. He starts from, Engels starts, as does Morgan, from the position that pre-class subsistence societies were characterized by simple foraging, hunting, and group marriage, different forms of group marriage, as you see from the slide. Tasks were carried out collectively, and the products distributed among the group for immediate consumption. This form of social organisation, which he termed savagery and barbarism, savage societies and barbarism societies, was very much in line with the language of 19th century social anthropology. So I'm not being an apologist for that. There was no, in those forms of societies, pre-class societies, there was no possibility of the private accumulation or appropriation of goods or labour. Women and men lived in relations of equality.
Mary, I'm really sorry, but you're muted for some reason.
So where did that just start?
No, you have to go back. You have to go back a little bit.
Oh, where was I up to? When I didn't even touch the screen. Okay, so I'll start off with basically. I'll start off with Engels again. He basically, what he's saying is that in pre-class societies there was subsistence. There was not a surplus. They were characterized by simple foraging and hunting, and there were matrilineal societies, and the family form was based on different, well, the consanguine family, Pinalian family pairing marriages. Basically, there were group marriages in which men and women were equal, and they were matrilineal, i.e., mother right pertain. And I'm not sure where I stopped, and I'm sorry if I don't know, but women's childbearing capacity influenced the development of a division of labour in which women were primarily responsible for childcare, and men, being more mobile, tended to undertake the tasks associated with larger game hunting, food gathering further afield, and so on. Women controlled the instruments of domestic production, while men controlled the instruments of hunting and warfare. Far from being subordinate, again, I have to stress, or Engels stresses, there's powerful evidence to suggest that women's role was crucial in the development of skills and knowledge central to the advancement of human social organisation. And tools, utensils, and so on. So there was a division of labour by sex in pre-class societies, but women's work was not regarded as inferior to that of men, as it is in class society. So the movement from simple subsistence to the production of a surplus laid the material basis for the development of trade, the appropriation of labour, particularly the labour of slaves, and the concept of private property. So basically, the development of plant and animal husbandry and more complex instruments of production, which could have reduced the sexual division of labour, but it didn't. The emergence of class societies, with the emergence of class societies came a deepening of the division, the sexual division of labour, and the attribution of an inferior status to women's work. And that really resulted in the overthrow of mother right, which, as you see, Engels termed the world historic defeat of the female sex. And precisely how this happened is, as Engels says, unknown. It's prehistoric. The patriarchal family emerged slowly, first within tribes or clans, and then more rapidly as monogamy developed. From the patrilineal clan system, which the later stage of barbarism, that pairing marriage, you could see that that was happening, emerged from the patrilineal clan system emerged the patriarchal family, in which a monogamous marriage and the patrilineal principles of inheritance formalized the complete subjugation of women. This is Engels. The only way in which paternity could be guaranteed was through the sequestration of women and their enforced sexual fidelity. Sexual fidelity, of course, only applied to women, not to men. Marriage was not based on what Engels termed sex love. Men found that elsewhere. But it was based purely on property and the need for procreation. And with monogamy and men's position, dominant position, prostitution emerged to satisfy men's sexual desires. There's a big chunk of this in Engels. In the patriarchal clan system, such male desires were satisfied through concubines. So men's rights are really to the fore. Monogamy was the only way to ensure that private property was passed through the male line to sons, they were almost always sons, of undisputed parentage. And that's the key thing. It's the property relationship through the male line, undisputed parentage. Actually, this is where where the whole chastity belts and all the rest of it emerged in the Middle Ages. But to carry on, for Engels, the patriarchal monogamous nuclear family represented the perfected, didn't really mean perfect, but perfected form of marriage for the transmission of property and the institutionalization of controls over women by men. And as he puts it in this famous phrase, the first class antagonism which appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage, and the first class oppression with that of the female sex by the male. So therefore Engels identifies two world historic defeats for women. One is the ending of mother right, and the other is the oppression of women by men in the monogamous nuclear family, in which the husband is the bourgeois and the wife is the proletarian. Again, another famous quote from Engels. So thus it's clear that the oppression of women and class exploitation appear in history coincidentally, not causally, but coincidentally, because of their common origin in the development of private property. The accumulation of wealth under private ownership was the material basis for the establishment of class society and the material basis for the oppression of women by the men who controlled that wealth. The ways in which different forms of class society, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism have oppressed women have assumed various historical forms, as has the precise nature of class exploitation. Not nearly enough is known about the position of women within slave and feudal societies, although it's clear that their status was subordinate to that of men. More is known about the oppression of women within capitalist society, especially industrial capitalism, of course, which Britain was the forerunner. Engels argued that the emancipation of women lay in the possibility of their involvement in social production. That is, women's entry into paid work, he thought, would decrease their isolation and financial dependence on men and bring them into contact with the trade union and labour movement. Because he saw the monogamous family as the instrument for the transmission of property, Engels believed that it would not survive amongst the working class for whom there was no property to transmit. However, herein lies the big problem, which I hope to discuss later, i.e. the problem of what happens and what is happening to the working class family. Engels was deeply committed to the principle of equality for women. He recognised that advances for women were possible within capitalism, but saw full emancipation as only possible in a socialist society in which there was political, social, and economic freedom. So, what happens next? Well, Engels might have been forgotten, not by us, but it might have been forgotten, were it not for the fact that in the 60s and 70s, we witnessed the burgeoning of a new women's movement, the second wave women's movement, the women's liberation movement. And with that movement, there was a concerted attempt to understand the origins of women's oppression. It was recognised, but why did it happen? Why did it come about? And in this context, in this new women's movement in the 60s and 70s, Engels was hotly debated. Many criticisms were launched against Engels' work. Some are valid, others were and are mere anti-Marxist cant. I'm not going to deal with the cant, but some of the arguments that I've summarised in the origins of the family have actually been widely misinterpreted and have given it sort of, I would say, a theoretical underpinning for many non-Marxist analysis. I only want to look at one of these, what I consider to be significant misinterpretations, and that is the very prevalent one and actually quite challenging one. And this is the so-called dual systems theory. Now, many socialist feminists have used Engels to support their argument that women's oppression and class oppression are two separate systems. And they cite this statement from Engels' Origin of the Family as their proof. This statement, oh, I'm sorry about this. Yes. I've put it up because it does require a bit of consideration. So according to the materialist conception, the determining factor of history is, in the final instance, the production and reproduction of immediate life. This again is a twofold character. On the one side, the production of the means of existence, of food, of clothing and shelter, and the tools necessary for that production. On the other side, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. The social organization under which the people of a particular historical epoch and a particular country live is determined by both kinds of production. The stage of development of labor on one hand and the family on the other. Well, that has been that's been interpreted as saying that there are two motives to history: the class struggle and the sex struggle. The site of the former, that is the class struggle, is the mode of production. We would all agree with that. But then they say the site of the latter, the second one, is that is the sex struggle, is the mode of reproduction. Now, I think that Engels' statement can only be read ambiguously if it's read in isolation from his works and from Marx's other works. Engels is clear that the oppression of women, the institution of the family, and all social relations must be dealt with in class terms, i.e. relations to specific modes of production. However, dual systems theory has led to a separation between these two modes, and you can see why from that quote that I just gave you, production and reproduction. And in practice, that attempt to separate these two modes of production has led to a number of erroneous theories, neo-Marxist, but supposedly, not, I would say non-Marxist, leading to misconceived practices. So, for example, just to run through a few of them, if sex struggle and male supremacy are universal, which is what is implied by the dual systems theory, and that they're autonomous, they either exist alongside or even instead of class struggle. Now, that obviously then gives a theoretical justification for separatism, because what's needed if women are to be liberated is a movement of all women to overthrow male supremacy. That would solve it. This dual systems theory also, I think, has led to the view that women can be used as a sex class. You see this term quite often, unrelated to the means of production, which is a complete misunderstanding of what class is, in my opinion. But women as a sex class basically implies that reproduction is seen as a mode of production which men own. Women are commodities producing use values, i.e. domestic labour, and exchange value in the form of reproducing the next generation of labour power, as well as maintaining the existing labour force. From all of this emerged a massive debate in the 70s and 80s, the so-called domestic labour debate, and its offshoot of that was the demand for wages for housework, which I haven't got time to go into, but I think it's clearly incorrect because it doesn't understand what a wage is. But that's another story. Now, two Marxist feminists have, from different perspectives, been at the forefront of rebutting the dual systems misrepresentation of Engels. Martha Gimenez in Marx Women and Capitalist Social Reproduction It's one of her books, and Lisa Vogel in Marxism and the Oppression of Women Towards a Unitary Theory. You can see the point about unitary theory, i.e. in opposition to the dualism. Those authors, Vogel and Gimnes, are highly critical of Engels for not applying, for what they say he doesn't do. He doesn't apply historical and dialectical materialism rigorously. In particular, because they say he fails to establish the relationship between the twofold character of production and reproduction. And it's his fault, therefore, because he didn't articulate the relationship that then opened the way for the dual systems misconstruction. Now, it's my contention here that Engels did not and could not have subscribed to dual systems theory. Nonetheless, the debate around the issue has given rise to an examination of two, I think, extremely important questions, one of which Engels didn't address adequately, and the other, I think, he got completely wrong. So I want to look at these two questions. First of all, Engels' omissions, let's say omissions, or at least an inadequate addressing of an issue. And that is to say, the first thing is this social reproduction and domestic labour. So this is the first question that he didn't address, is the role of domestic labour as a component of socially necessary labour. Now, Marx gives us the clue to understanding domestic labour as a component of social reproduction when he defines the capitalist wage system as, to quote him, the wages are the monetary expression of the value of labour power. That value of labour power, i.e. wages, is determined by the amount of socially necessary labour time required for the production and reproduction of the labourer. So there are two elements into socially necessary labour time, SNLT, the maintenance of labourer and the production of the next generation. There are two aspects. This is not dualism, this is two aspects of socially necessary labour time. And this entails two things. One is the essential function of the daily revival of the male labourer. This entails his eating, sleeping, watching over his health, just unwinding to replenish his family in order to work effectively the next day. For this, his wife, and it usually is his wife or a woman, cooks his food, cleans his house and clothing, and provides nurture. So that is to do with the maintenance of the labourer. The labourer has to eat in order to live and has to be clothed and all the rest of it. The second aspect of socially necessary labour is the replacement of one generation of workers by the next, by the workforce by the next. And this obviously entails a woman's biological role in giving birth and her social role in rearing children. Now, both these tasks are performed typically, but not always, in a monogamous nuclear family. But socially necessary labour time is important in another respect. It gives rise to what we now term the family wage paid to the male breadwinner. Within a nuclear family, the full wage for the production and reproduction of human life is only given to one member, the man, who is seen as the male breadwinner. A man can't reproduce human life, only a woman can. So although women enter the labour market and sell their labour power for a wage, they do so under less favourable conditions than men due to their biological function of bearing and rearing future generations. For women, this presents the contradiction between their role in the public sphere of production and in the private sphere of the reproduction and domestic labour. And this is the reason for unequal pay. In the former, i.e. in the sphere of the sphere of production, they produce use values, the other way around. in the private sphere of reproduction, they produce use values for which they're not paid. And in the latter, they produce exchange value for which they are always paid less than men. Now, Marx understood this when he noted that cotton manufacturers preferred to use the labour of women with children. Why? Because the mill owner could pay them less than men, and they would accept it precisely because they're women with dependent children. In one of the most telling pieces of contemporary evidence, James Mitchell, a British factory commissioner, unwittingly revealed before Marx, a Marxist analysis of the fact and the purpose of the super exploitation of women. In 1833, he wrote, "Some persons feel much regret at seeing the wages of females so low, but perhaps such persons are wrong, and nature affects her own purpose more wisely and more effectually than could be done by the wisest of men. The low price of female labour makes it the most profitable as well as the most agreeable occupation for a female to superintend her own domestic establishment, and her low wages do not tempt her to abandon the care of her own children." So he's making the connection as a factory inspector that the low price of labour is precisely related to their role in domestic production, and that's why they get that low wage. And in the condition of the English working class, Engels does come close to recognising this, but misunderstands its significance, as we shall see. It should be noted here that women are not a reserve, and never were a reserve army. They were the first factory workers. The conditions of 1844 notes this, and subsequently women have always worked, because the so-called family wage is a myth and has never been enough to sustain a so-called typical family, let alone an atypical one. But the myth of the family wage, i.e. the wage paid to the male breadwinner for the reproduction and production of human life, persisted as an ideological construct which has penetrated into labour movement thinking really from the 1850s onwards, with the rise of the labour aristocracy and the trade union acceptance of unequal pay, a marriage bar, and the notion of the male breadwinner. We could discuss that a bit more, but in fact, that was the basis for the exclusion of women by better paid male workers from the workforce. Now, I want to deal now with what I consider to be an error that Engels made, and this is in relation to the working class family. I hinted at that before. Excuse me. As we've seen, Engels' theory of the family and women's oppression is based on the notion that the monogamous nuclear family emerged in class society because of the need to ensure that property owned by the male was passed to sons of undisputed parentage. Now, of course, that makes an awful lot of sense for those who have property, i.e. the bourgeois family. But how could this then apply to the propertyless working class family who own nothing but their labour power, which they're forced to sell for a wage? Well, Engels assumed that the working class monogamous family would disappear, as we've seen, because there was no material basis, that is to say, property, for its existence. Now, of course, that wasn't the case, and is not the case. Engels couldn't explain the survival of the working class family because of his failure to appreciate the impact on the working class itself of ruling class ideology, and in particular, a ruling class ideology of the family, the deeply impregnated notion of sexism and family values. And this was a major aspect of ruling class ideology from, I would say, the dawn of class society, but certainly under capitalism. Engels observed that he didn't analyse the subordinate status of working class women within the workplace and in the family. In fact, in conditions, he seems to blame working women for the neglect of children and for what he thought was the immoral behaviour of unmarried women. In conditions, he notes that in flax spinning mills, over 70% of the workers are women, and that this has ruinous consequences for I'm quoting him, ruinous consequences for the workers because the employment of women at once breaks up the family. He says the family is not dissolved, but is turned upside down. He's talking about role reversal in the family, where the women work and the men are left at home. He's actually talking about hand-loom weavers in this case. But basically, he says that with the family being turned upside down and role reversal, there is disastrous impact on infant mortality and on extremely low life expectancy, incredibly low. In the 1830s in Manchester, 17 was a good age to live. He notes that this, what he calls unsane state of things, unsexes the man and takes from the woman all womanliness. And he appears, therefore, Engels appears to agree with the factory commissioner for Lancashire, a man called Dr. Hawkins, who hopes that the time may come in which married women will be shut out of factories. So he, and of course that certainly didn't happen. So I don't think, in addition to this, which you could say was the product of a 24-year-old man not fully comprehending what he was seeing and being part of the kind of ideology that was so prevalent at the time, nonetheless, in Origins, 40 years later, it's clear to me that Engels didn't take account of a number of things. First of all, the role that the family unit plays in the reproduction and maintenance of labour power, which I've mentioned before. Secondly, the role of the family as an economic unit, which not only fills the capitalist fundamental need for the reproduction of labour power, but the family-based division of labour also enables capitalism to keep down the social wage. They don't have to spend so much money on public services like childcare, education, healthcare. So family as an economic unit is important. But family also as a unit of consumption is vitally important, because basically what the vital aspect of capitalism is the fact that workers use the wages that they earn to purchase the commodities they produce. So Engels' incorrect formulation of what I think was his incorrect formulation of working class family in 1844 was repeated in the Origins, although he does, I think, 40 years on, acknowledge some of the contradictions. And I just quote this from the Origins, chapter 2. Not until the coming of modern large-scale industry was the road to social production open to her again, as the woman, and then only to the proletarian wife. But it was opened in such a manner that if she carries out her duties in the private service of her family, she remains excluded from public production and unable to, if she wants to take part in public production and earn independently, she cannot carry out family duties. Well, actually, she can, and she did. So I want just now to update this a little bit by women workers and the family today. Modern large-scale industry and women's entry into social production has not solved anything for working class women. In fact, it has exacerbated the unresolved contradiction which Engels noted just now in the quote I just read, the unresolved contradiction between work and home, public and private. Unequal pay was and has remained a feature of women's employment in capitalist society. Apart from pay inequality, the other important fact of women's employment in the period of industrial capitalism and today was and is the phenomenon of job segregation. The existence of women's jobs, in inverted commas, within the labour market would surely disprove the myth that women workers are a transitory element of the capitalist workforce, constituted some kind of industrial reserve army, to be called to the colours when male labour is scarce, as in times of war. Although the example of women workers in the cotton factories was cited earlier, such work was actually the exception rather than the norm, and aroused much interest at the time. Victorian Blue Books, for example, precisely for this reason. What women's very public role in these kind of industries, cotton industry in particular, laid bare in a very visible manner the contradiction in the moral notion of the sanctity of the family and women's place within it, as against the drive of capitalism to exploit a section of the workforce which were rendered vulnerable precisely because of domestic responsibilities. The super exploitation of women workers existed outside factory production and has remained and still does much more hidden from public scrutiny and hence largely ignored. Apart from cotton textiles and pottery, women were not to be found in large numbers in many of the other factory-based industries as they developed during the course of the 19th century. And domestic work was a major employer of women. In fact, taken as a whole, women factory workers remained a small minority of the female population. The vast majority of women workers were and still are to be found in more hidden areas of work, domestic service, as you see, the sweated trades, and homeworking, various kinds of small sweated workshops in such trades as lace making, glove making, straw plaiting, millinery. A similar kind of sexual division of labour can be found in Britain today, where women workers are clustered in a narrow range of women's jobs, prime amongst them being clerical work, shop work, textile work, caring, cleaning, catering. And two factors characterise this sexual division of labour historically and currently. First, these jobs are always very low paid. And secondly, that much of this work represents an extension of women's work within the family. In other words, the centuries-old division of labour within the family, which predates capitalism, as we've seen, has been transferred from the realms of the private household to social production. This partly explains why women's skills within these jobs have been and continue to be so undervalued and thus underpaid. Given the undervaluation of women's work within the home, it's hardly surprising that when similar tasks are transferred to social production, their undervaluation persists. This attitude is reinforced by the belief that women's jobs are somehow peripheral to the economy and hence can be fitted in with women's role in the home. The prevalence of part-time work for women is made to appear as a great concession by capital to enable women workers to perform their dual responsibilities. In reality, it's nothing of the sort. Part-time work for women accounts for a staggering 44% of female labour in Britain today, the highest by far of any European country. Far from being a kindly concession, it's an important device to allow the maximum flexibility of the female labour force at the minimum possible cost in terms of employment rights, job opportunities and pay, and also minimal cost to the neoliberal state's constant reduction of the social wage. In other words, women supposedly can combine their two functions within the home and within social production if they work part-time and kill themselves in the process. Historically, the trend towards part-time work for women coincided with the social reforms implemented after the Second World War, and this may seem paradoxical, but it can be explained by the fact that the benefit system was based on the presupposition that everybody is a member of a family which is looked after by a male breadwinner, hence women's contributions less than men and what women take up less than men. Women shouldn't need to go out and anyway shouldn't want to because their place is in the home. So however, while ideology decreed that women's place was in the home, the labour market determined otherwise. Women's work is needed In fact, today, the female employment rate has reached a record high of 72.4%. That's in December 2019. But half of it, as I said before, on part-time, casual or 0 hours contracts. The preponderance of such contractual arrangements is frequently justified in the name of flexibility. They're commended to women as being family friendly. Part-time work is a family friendly policy. In fact, the opposite is true. Uncertainty about a regular source of income, together with poverty, wages and lack of affordable childcare, increases the burden on women and perpetuates a cycle of deprivation. So, the phenomenal form of the working class family may have changed since 1844, but its role and function remains the same, especially in relation to women. Capitalism hasn't solved, nor does it wish to resolve, the essential contradiction between women's role in the family in the sphere of the private sphere of domestic reproduction and her role in the labour market, in the public sphere of social production. We don't need a dual systems theory to explain this. The capitalist mode of production is the system. That is a unitary system. Capitalism is dependent on the super-exploitation and oppression of women. Its clever ideological role is to mask the contradictions. The role of Marxists is to reveal them. Engels has started this process. He couldn't be expected to say it all. This is our job. So just very briefly, to return to Engels on his 200th birthday, at least in 2 days' time it is. So despite my criticisms of one aspect of his work, and that is to say on the working class family and women's place within it, his contribution overall is immense. The two works that I've concentrated on represent a fraction of his total output, but the origins of the family may not have given us all the answers, but it's certainly given us some tools to help posit the correct questions. Engels' lasting contribution is he's opened the way to construct a Marxist theory of the origins of women's oppression, which overcomes the gross limitations of empiricist and idealist perspectives. We must build on this.
Wonderful, Mary. Thank you. It's certainly given me the appetite to return to the original books and read them again. Well, thanks for that. We have got some questions in the chat, and if people want to put some more in, they're welcome, and if we've got the time, we will take them. So you ready for some questions, Mary?
Oh yeah. Can I drink water first, please? Wait. Okay, ready. Okay,
we've got two questions from Shireen, to be very greedy. She says why has materialist feminism all but disappeared from view?
Sorry, why?
Materialist feminism all but disappeared from view. And would a resurgence of the discussion of materialist feminism and its application to current conditions help us to find a way through the current crisis of women's rights and the attempted replacement of sex by gender identity?
Can we take a couple more just so I can get my breath back?
Yeah, just hang on a sec. I'll just scroll down and I'll get them. Yeah, I've got one from Vivian, and she's asking, could mill owners have envisaged, say it properly, that the machinery could be operated by women just as well as men, and by giving opportunities to women, women became early feminists?
Sorry, I don't quite understand.
Okay. Could mill owners have envisaged, see, I still can't say it, that the machinery could be operated by women just as well as men, and by giving opportunities to women, could they become early feminists? I think that's what she means. Did you get that?
Well, I think so.
Okay. Do you want any more?
Yeah, just one more.
Okay, let me see what we've got. Okay, I've got one here. Would you agree that there was a tendency of feminists in the past to see all women as one homogenous group? And clearly they're not. Race, sexuality, etc. How do we and now feel a question of difference between women in respect to class? Was A, recognised by Engels, and B, recognised in this talk in respect to gender and class. For example, middle class women and better access to education and childcare.
Okay, shall I go?
Yeah.
Right. On the first question, why has a materialist feminist analysis disappeared? Oh, I wish I knew. That's what we've got to pay attention to and build it, because if we don't, then I think we are in danger of being almost eradicated as a sex. The gender identity debate can happen, fine, but we need a debate about women and women's oppression. I think this re-looking at Engels gives us the chance to do that. If you ask me why it's disappeared, I think it's because we haven't paid nearly enough attention to theory. Whatever happened in the 60s and 70s, I mentioned, the emergence of a women's movement, and a lot of the theories were bonkers, but there was an attempt, at least a grand narrative. I think the part of the problem for us today is that we need to build a women's movement, and we haven't got one. We've got fragments of bits and pieces of one, but that's what's necessary. But alongside that, I think has to come a real reworking and looking at a materialist feminist analysis, and that means an understanding of Marxism, which is what basically our two libraries tried to do in their own ways, Marx Memorial Library and the Working Class Movement Library. That's what we have to do. I mean, it's just getting back to basics. Marx and Engels didn't say it all. I mean, I tried to say that. What we have to do is to renew Marxism in the 21st century, building on the insights of historical and dialectical materialism, but that means looking at some of the issues which Marx and Engels either didn't deal with fully. How could they? They can't do everything, or we might want to not revise them, but use those methods. So I haven't answered the question fully, but I think this is a major question that has to be asked and re-asked and answered many times. The mill owners of the 19th century did prefer using women because they could pay them less. They came up against the problem that the employment of women under the conditions that they were working, pitiful conditions they were working, was having a very deleterious effect on the working class family, in the sense that one of the reasons for shocking infant mortality rates is that women often had to give birth on the factory floor. There was no safe substitute for breast milk. But women were back at work within a day of confinement. Well, they weren't confined. I mean, they just had their babies and carried on working. The only the substitute for breast milk was there wasn't one, but what infants were given to the care of older relatives was water laced with laudanum, and that kept them quiet forever, often. So they came smack up against this problem. Marx talks about it in volume 1 of Capital, when he looks at the working day. Capitalism left to its own devices would have actually burnt out and destroyed their own generation of labour power. The state, even in laissez-faire Britain, where the state wasn't supposed to intervene at all, they had to intervene and to pass factory legislation to stop the rapacious mill owners from actually destroying their own labour force, or at least the next generation of it. So that's one of the reasons why, in a way, the ideology of the family led to women being hidden from history, actually, hidden from view. They carried on working, but in much less obvious and visible areas of work. And of course, on the question of women are not a homogenous group, obviously not. I would argue that all women are oppressed, but not all women are exploited. Only women who have to sell their labour power for a wage are exploited. And the problem that we've got is a notion of feminism which thinks that somehow or other that if a few more women break through the glass ceiling, for example, to have a woman as a prime minister or someone as a newsreader or in a high, suddenly somehow or other that benefits all women. It doesn't. It doesn't at all. And of course, we shouldn't see women as a homogenous group. The key thing for us is to understand that the basis of all oppression is class exploitation. And unless we can see that actually whatever the gains that people think we've made, i.e. we've got, since Engels' day, we have got the right to vote, we have got the right to education and go to universities and all the rest of it. Yes, but that doesn't mean that we're liberated. Actually, women's liberation fully can only take place in a socialist society. That's why we want to have to be socialist. So not all women, especially women who own property, and they do, would agree with us on that.
Okay, we've got some more. You ready for some more?
Oh,
we've got a comment with a question in it. So, comment is, perhaps the destruction of the family as a site for effective relations for the working class might account for the fact that defending the family has become an important aspect of working class ideology, i.e. it's more complicated than ruling class ideology. Would you agree? Do you want to answer that?
I'm not sure I understood. So is the question saying that therefore we should defend the family because it's under attack? Or don't think I understood the question.
Okay. It's saying perhaps the destruction of the family as a site for effective relations for the working class might account for the fact that defending the family has become an important aspect of working class ideology, i.e. it's more complicated than ruling class ideology. Would you agree? I think they're asking about whether or not what's name is that why would working class people defend the family as a group, maybe?
I don't think that it's not a question of attacking or defending the family. It's a question of analysing its role and the role of women in it. That's I don't think that's the issue. And of course, everybody wants to defend everybody wants to defend the kind of any sort of loving relationship that they've got. But the problem is to see what the role of the family is one thing, and to analyse that correctly, I think, is one thing. That doesn't mean to say that you attack or that you defend or support it. So I don't think that analysing the function of the family implies either one thing or the other. What I think that the ideology of the family, which is used by the ruling class, is completely specious, because they always talk about working families and working this and working that, and yet and family-friendly policies you know, they elevate this for what is an ideological construct into something which it absolutely isn't. I mean, what is a family? It is actually, this is such a big question. I think we could have another talk on this. Is it the role of socialists to defend the family? Question mark. But if I was to go on, I think this would see out the rest of this session. So I think we should have another discussion on this.
Okay, we're getting lots of questions in, so apologies if I'm not taking your question, but I'm going to not ask similar questions that Mary's already answered. But there's one question here which says, did Engels speak to or against the British trade union movement's position of maintaining the predominance of the male sphere of industry over women's role?
Did he? Well, he did say that he thought that the English working class was becoming as bourgeois as the bourgeoisie. I mean, he quite lamented the way I mean, if you look at British labour history, you could see that in the period where he was a young man in Manchester, and when he wrote the conditions of the English working class, that was a sort of pretty revolutionary period in terms of working class struggle with Chartism, with all the movements that were going on, the formation of early unions. Things began to change in the 1850s when the British economy had sort of levelled out, and Britain was now the workshop of the world, and that gave rise to what Lenin called the labour aristocracy, the people who formed the so-called new model unions, based on the model of the Amalgamated Engineering Society of Engineers. Better paid workers. There was a visible and physical difference between those workers who very much identified with the system in a way, I suppose you could say. This was the phenomenon of liberalism. That's what, and Engels sort of noted that the fact that by 1867, the labour aristocrats, these better paid workers, mainly workers who were involved in the export trades, manufacturing for the export trades, staple industries, they got the vote in 1867. They didn't set up their own party. They voted Liberal, hence the phenomenon of liberalism. So he said in a letter to Marx that the English ruling class, the English society has got the most successful bourgeoisie, and that has now managed to spread bourgeois ideas to the workers. Then, of course, by the 1880s, at the time that he was writing The Origins, there was a bit of a turnaround, and unions were developed, or were being developed amongst semi-skilled and unskilled workers. And this is where he participated in the struggle with Eleanor Marx, and unions, very different sorts of unions were formed. Did he particularly comment on their attitude to women? He did in letters. I can't quote them, but this basically in the skilled trades, which the new model unions were, women were completely excluded, and completely excluded from the trade union movement. So by implication, the struggles of the 1880s onwards included women. So he certainly wasn't happy about women's exclusion from trade unions at all, or the phenomenon of liberalism.
Okay, I've got one here which is a more general one about culture. To what extent does the loss of a shared culture have on the building of a momentum of movements? By shared culture, I mean the advent of social media and the ability to walk through life with no awareness of anything beyond a news feed. And they acknowledge the assumption that when everyone only had a radio or a couple of TV channels, that meant a shared culture and awareness.
This is a question for a.
We've got 5 minutes.
A cultural theorist, really. I mean, the problem is that we haven't got a shared culture. I'm always a little bit concerned about questions like this because it doesn't recognise, I think, the fact that we are controlled through the ideological apparatus of the state. Our own culture has been completely what culture we have, there's been a concerted attempt to smash it. You know, if you think about just the folk tradition, we don't have that. We don't have, you know, any kind of the kind of songs that were sung. You know, all of that's gone. Basically, the ideological apparatus of the state, which consists of the media, everything that the education system, all of these things, and now social media, which we don't control. The only thing we've got is our own paper, and that's got pitifully few readers, not enough readers, I should say. So I don't think there is a shared culture, but it's not our culture. It's a culture that's been imposed on us. And that's the problem. I don't know how we resolve that, other than through working class organisations. But even so, there's always a struggle within those to get an acceptance of our ideas. So shared culture, is not a culture that I share, because it's not mine, it's theirs, and it's imposed. I don't think that answers the question at all, but still.
Okay, Mary. We've got one which I think is an important question. We seem to encounter an insurmountable, get me words out, obstacle in that left-wing organisations are largely controlled by men. Many of these men are hostile to any analysis which names them as oppressors. Are we resigned to a watered-down class reductionist feminism, which criticises capitalism, but not men's role in the perpetuation of material and ideological sexism?
Well, absolutely right. This is where I came in. I mean, when in this sort of second wave women's movement, that was the whole problem, wasn't it? You know, the role of a revolutionary woman is to wash a revolutionary man's socks. In other words, that, you know, class, the struggle against women's oppression was really not it. It was subordinate to the class struggle, and it based on a complete misunderstanding of what class is and where women fit. Women aren't a class, but women, like them, belong to a class, and the vast majority of women do belong to the working class. And you can't achieve, you know, the slogan of trade unions is always unity is strength. Well, who we're uniting with? I mean, the fact is that the British labour movement throughout its history until, I would say, the 1960s was totally male dominated, totally. We campaigned and battled for years, and we're still campaigning and battling to have a greater visibility or higher profile of women within the trade union movement, but not just for women who want to pull up the drawbridge after them. What we're seeing, I think, is within the trade union movement now is actually going backwards on the women's question. That under the cover of a sort of a generic equality, which has all sorts of disadvantaged, in inverted groups, competing for scarce resources in this sort of kind of miasma of an equalities agenda, whatever that's supposed to mean. We are actually half the human race. We're over half of the workforce. There's no special pleading to include women. There can't be any progress without women. And I do think that it's absolutely correct to say that men have, lots of men, not all men, have simply not understand the importance of ensuring that women, the struggle of women is part of the struggle. There won't be any. Every socialist should be a feminist. But I'm not saying that every feminist should be a socialist. I'd like that to be the case, but you can't call yourself a socialist unless you're a feminist. And more men understand this and recognise it, and not have to be browbeaten to say this. We have to get past this thing that somehow or other women's struggle is an adjunct or is not part of the struggle. We have to redefine class struggle in a way which understands the absolutely integral and imperative role of women within it, and black people come to mind. In other words, to recognise that the way in which capitalist exploitation is maintained is through oppressing the most visible groups of workers. Those most visible groups are women because of their sex, and black workers because of the colour of their skin. There can't be any progress without that recognition.
Okay. Are you okay for a couple more questions on the time?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can find a couple of for you. Hang on, I've just lost my comments. Where's it gone? Sorry, apologies. One day we'll be able to run one of these without technical difficulties.
Yeah. Tell me about technical difficulties.
Okay, there was a question about someone wanted to go back to, you said that you had a criticism of Engels. Could you just briefly go over what the bit was that you criticised?
Oh, it was really on the question of the working class family. His analysis of the origin of the family was quite correctly based on property, private property, and the appropriation of private property by men, and their desire then to ensure that they could pass on that property to their male sons of undisputed parentage. So my question, point is that how could that possibly be relevant to the existence of the working class family who have no property? And I'm not saying that he discounted the working class family, but I don't think his analysis, and that's really what half of this lecture was about, that tried to see what its role was, because clearly it has survived. And I think it's partly to do with ruling class ideology, but partly to do with all the stuff that I mentioned about its role in maintaining and reproducing labour power. Because if you just took the logic of his argument, then for workers, the family has got no meaning. There is no property to inherit. And actually the same issue, well, I could say the same thing, issue arose after the Russian Revolution, when the people like Kollontai and Krupskaya advanced the most, well, really enacted some of the most progressive family laws. They allowed the first country in the world really to have legalized, or divorce was just almost automatically. They talked about the socialization of housework and made massive inroads into that. I'm not saying it all lasted, but you know, the Lenin talked about housework as being petty, stultifying and degrading. It's always done by women. And that for women to be liberated, they have to be liberated from all the ties that bound them to the home. I think that Engels, that's what Engels talked about. He did talk about the socialization of housework, but he's kind of skipped a stage because he assumed that everything would be okay when women entered massively into social production. But because it actually, what that meant was that it exacerbated the contradictions for women. Then said, of course, that all those questions wouldn't be resolved until socialism, which is true. But I think that his lack of analysis of the working class family really did not explain why the family survived, and it still does, even though, in his terms, the material basis for its existence doesn't exist. My argument is that there is a material basis of the existence of the family. It's not just based on property. It's based on all these other things to do with the production, reproduction of labour power, etc., etc., etc.
Okay, wonderful, Mary. I think we'll leave you there because time's pushing on. Can I thank you, Mary, for your lecture and for answering those questions. I think most people would agree with me that it was enlightening tonight, and hopefully it's made us go away and read some other materials on this, including, of course, if I give a shameless plug to your own book that's just been republished, Women in Class. Yeah. Excuse me. Can I just say before we go, can I just mention to everyone, of course, this evening, this was co-hosted by both the Marx Memorial Library and the Working Class Movement Library, and both libraries during the current crisis, the pandemic, the plague, whatever you want to call it, has what's his name continued to provide a number of webinars and events for people to watch. And hopefully what I hope you do is that you visit their websites and see what events are coming up. I've got time to talk about them all tonight, otherwise we'll be here till 10 o'clock. But can I just mention a couple of things? The Working Class Movement Library has just launched its Radical Reader, where we're asking people to become a radical reader and donate some money to the library. And there is some wonderful t-shirts on offer, which I would recommend, which are modelled on the website by Maxine Peake. Maxine is a great friend of both libraries, and that gives me a nice link into the meeting that the Marx Memorial Library are having next Thursday at the same time as this, to launch its patrons scheme. And Maxine will be in discussion with John McDonnell about the role of the library and the reason why we need to support the library. And I'm going to finish on that. So thanks, Mary, again. Thank you for the librarians of both libraries for helping us set this up, and Jonathan for fighting with the technical issues, and of course Mary for the lecture. And thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you got something from it, and I hope to see you again. Thanks very much. Good night.
Bob, don't go for a minute.
I won't.